Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's joined us live. My name is Chiteshri, and I am an education manager at the SDG Academy. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce you to this first live Q&A session that we have in the course that is Human Rights, Human Wrongs. Joining us today are Professor Joshua Castellino and Professor Sarah Bradshaw, both based in London. So it is, I think, about 6 in the evening for them. I'm based in New Delhi. This is in a sense, the entire human rights course team that is here who brought this course to you via the SDG Academy and now available on edX. So let me start by giving this giving the audience view just a small perspective on who both of you are, Joshua and Sarah, because as I said, as I was just saying, that some of them may have looked into your bios and of course introduced, but then because we're competing with so many other courses on human rights, it's just nice that they know the rich experience that you come from, and of course a context from how you became involved in this course and what your general knowledge and background is. So over to you, Joshua.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chiteshri, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are, and thank you for enrolling on our course, and we hope that we will share this journey with you throughout the next 11 or 12 weeks and hear from you and engage with you. My name is Joshua Castellino. I'm Executive Director at Minority Rights Group International, which is an NGO, civil society organization that was set up nearly 50 years ago by a man called David Astor, who was then the editor of one of the most influential newspapers here in the UK and continues to be an influential newspaper. It's called The Observer. And essentially, David Astor had already 5 years before that, in the early 60s and onwards, been interested in this issue of human rights and worried about the extent to which there were prisoners of conscience. So he was part of a group of people whose organization that you've probably heard of called Amnesty International. But 5 years later, he kept seeing reports of minorities, indigenous peoples coming across his desk in dire state all across the world. And I guess he realized that even if you did manage to create a human rights organization, you would still need to find somebody or something or group of people who would try and advocate and give voice to the voiceless. So that's Minority Rights Group International, which is where I'm based at now. We work in all around the globe with around 160 partner organizations, doing a variety of different things. We do campaigning where that is necessary. We do litigation. We challenge power directly, indirectly. We work to build the capacity of the groups that we work with, and we do all kinds of other work on education and consulting and giving advice to people around the world. So that's what I do now. Sarah,
and what did you used to do?
What did I used to do? Well, I used to spend my time writing books and sitting down and thinking in academia. And I was at Middlesex University. I was Dean of the School of Law and the Business School. Just before this, I still retain a small role at Middlesex University, mainly because I want to continue teaching. So, Sarah.
Okay, well, I asked Joshua what he used to do, very politely though, because I've stepped in now into Joshua's shoes, trying to fill them, which is a very difficult job. And I am now the head of the School of Law at Middlesex University. I have been with Middlesex University for a very long time. So I went very much traditional path. I did my PhD around gendered rights, and then I joined the university to teach in development studies. But within about 2 or 3 years, I realized that I was teaching about something that I'd researched on, but never actually done. So then I took a break from the university and went and lived and worked in Central America, specifically in Nicaragua. And there I very much was working with feminist organizations and gendered NGOs around promoting gendered rights, sexual reproductive rights, women's rights in general. So I was working very much with them at the grassroots level, but also lobbying World Bank, UN, around their policies. I keep that relationship today, although those who know what's going on in Nicaragua will know it's quite tense at the moment there and across the region. But I continue that, so I spend my time, my academic year teaching and increasingly attending meetings and doing other things that Joshua used to do, which is lovely. And then the rest of the time I'm involved in research and activism campaigning around rights and gendered rights. So that's basically who I am.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua, Sarah. And And thank you so much for joining us. Just for context to everybody who's watching live, we will be having this live session every second Monday. So please send us your questions, and you know that Joshua and Sarah will be here to answer them until the end of this course. I'd like to begin with a very interesting comment that we received, which was via the pre-course survey. And this was a gentleman who said that he has been very skeptical when it comes to the notion of human rights and has always believed that it's been used by groups for justifying their political objectives without having a ground of their own for why they want such a rigorous public discourse in human rights. And he says that he hopes to be challenged in the process of learning through these 11 weeks as he learns this course. And at the same time, he speaks about how the one thing he's appreciative of the general discourse on human rights is understanding the voice of the indigenous people. So Joshua, I'm well aware that you've had a rich experience in this. And it's interesting that we have people who are questioning the notion of human rights. And on some level, I think I do relate, because as of last year, I think it's been 70 years since we've had the declaration, and yet we know that human rights issues all over the world are burgeoning and there are new conflicts coming up. At the same time, former conflicts have not been resolved. So what would be your context on who is representing whom and what we need to think about in the general understanding of human rights today?
Yeah, a loaded question in many ways, I think, and the skepticism is something that we see now across political divides. So we used to see a skepticism from people who perhaps didn't necessarily believe in the need to create a society that respected the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, and who believed instead that you need to have a society where you have free competition and that competition will win, and ultimately competition will sort out our society in a direction it wants to go in. Now you see skepticism across the board, from people who believe in or thought they believed in a human rights virtue, people who didn't think that they necessarily believed in the fact that power should be unfettered. So you see skepticism, in other words, has become quite a norm in terms of human rights. And when you often think about human rights, skepticism is not far behind. Partly that's because of the way in which human rights has been used as a useless rhetoric by politicians. So very often politicians would take stage and talk about the dignity of human beings when clearly they didn't have any intention or any insight into how to uphold it. My own journey, I started off as a skeptic, as a complete skeptic. I used to work at Indian Express newspapers in India. And I think one of my first experiences, and I think I might have spoken about this in the actual film, but one of my first experiences very early on as a journalist was to cover the demolition of slums. And so I went to the demolition of slums, and I basically saw these people being turfed out of their shanty towns in the slums that neighbor one of Asia's largest slum in Bombay. And my first reaction was, but there's a rule of law. Don't worry about this. We'll just get the necessary parties to be involved. The police will be here. They will stand up for your rights. You'll be okay. To which I think this particularly wizened woman looked at me and said, yes, I understand you think that there are human rights, but that's for the rich to us. So that was one experience of where I immediately was confronted with skepticism, but also partly because it's been hard. I think when you grow up in a post-colonial country, human rights, along with the environment at that time, were used as two tools to beat up non-Western countries, to say, you are shockingly behind. Look at your appalling human rights record. So you grow up with an antagonism towards human rights because you think this is a way in which you're somehow made, your country is made to look somehow less well endowed compared to everybody else. Of course, the boot's on the other foot now because the human rights violations are universal and global and occurring as much in the North as they are in the South. What I say to the person who's skeptical, work with us, listen to us, keep an open mind. You just need to accept the fact and don't be put off by the fact that this has been a 70-year struggle that hasn't yielded a world full of human rights. There are many struggles that haven't yielded a world full of better and more progressive things. And I think we speak about this at a time in 2019 when political uncertainty has become the norm. So the fact that we've been at it for a long time and haven't succeeded, I don't think that one way or another that defeats the idea. That means that we haven't been effective in promoting human rights. That's a different matter. And on that, I fully agree. We haven't been effective. But do human rights have something to offer? In my view, absolutely yes. They are the starting point that reiterates the importance of every individual, and the challenge is the extent to which we can create systems that effectively uphold that. Sarah?
I think we'll find as we go through these live discussions, Joshua and I often debate the validity of rights, and I tend to come on the side of questioning Joshua very much. And I think there is the idea of the regime of rights, which I think we need to be very careful about, but also, as you're saying, this notion of how rights are understood. I remember a young woman that when we were doing some group work in Nicaragua, and she came up with the line that rights are nice, but they're not real life. And the very notion that, again, it's not that it was just for the rich, it just wasn't for young people as well. That you were around economic necessity and trying to get on. And then when you got older, perhaps then you could demand your rights. But as a young person, your voice wasn't heard and you weren't really sure what your rights were. So I think that all those issues are really important to think about and to accept that, yes, we haven't really got it clear what it means to have rights, and that people understand that they have rights and those rights are upheld.
I need to come back to say that I disagree with the fact that we haven't got it clear. We've spent a lot of time trying to agree on what those rights are. The problem is it's contained in a very, very small elite group of people, and it hasn't been able to break out of that. So, part of this is, because when you say that it isn't clear, the last thing we need is a massive discussion again of what the rights are, because we're not getting any further. We're not progressing on any of those discussions. The rights are there, they're flawed. Some of them are well articulated, some of them are less well articulated. I think implementation is the key, because somehow these kinds of ventures on what are rights, and you immediately see it's going to capture the brightest and the best. It's going to take that talent, put it in a room, and they're going to have these navel-gazing conversations about what rights are. In the meantime, that whole discussion that's there to play for in the public square, that's just going to be disconnected, because those people aren't going to be invited.
Well, are all rights clear? Gendered rights, for example, are contested. They're not accepted as rights. So to me, the notion of rights doesn't cover what, for many people, are rights.
In what sense are gendered rights?
In the sense that the sexual reproductive health and rights, sexual rights are not,
so
in many countries, seem to be rights.
Absolutely.
So that's what I'm meaning by the need to discuss what we mean by rights, and it's not clear.
But let's take that particular example. So reproductive rights absolutely are contested in many places. They are one component of a wider set of rights around gender that are well accepted. So if you say there are components, absolutely, there are issues within all of the rights that are not as articulated as we might want them to be. But basically, where is our priority now? Trying to get universal acceptance on those questions, or trying to implement the massive painting of rights, the massive edifice of rights that is recognized? So I think, in a sense, yes, we will never, ever, ever get to, probably even in utopia, we won't get to a stage where every right has been fully thought through and reified in different ways. There will always be contestations. But to say that, well, the building doesn't exist because I've seen a flow on the 18th floor where there's a window broken.
No, but the flaw's in the foundations. Because for women, if sexual reproductive rights are fundamental to their autonomy and mobility, then it's not on the 18th floor, it's at the foundations. And therefore, I would contest the notion that
but again, so we always get back to the same point where you think, okay, so this is contested and it's unclear, so we have a choice now. We either say, well, what's the point of that? Let's leave it. And many people have, and perhaps some of you who are doing the course may feel that way, and if you work with us, you might still feel the way.
Okay, while we're in this chicken and egg syndrome. Okay, for some reason I can hear my voice echo. Sorry.
We don't.
Okay, so while we're in this chicken and egg syndrome and we're discussing this, actually, Sarah, you raised a really, I thought was a valuable question, even though I didn't understand the way it was framed in the context of it, but I thought that I should ask you this question. It popped into our discussion forum back into our live course, where a gentleman has asked us that in context to sexual rights and human existence, he believes that sex is much more of a moral and social issue. So when we're talking about promoting sexual and reproductive rights, or perhaps, and he was speaking specifically in the context of LGBT rights. He says that do we promote, when we're promoting their rights, I mean, and he's disassociating himself from the LGBT community largely, aren't we questioning humanity's existence at large, because they're not able to procreate, one, as children, and then of course he also believes that sexual and reproductive issues as such shouldn't come into the purview of rights, because it's more to do with morality. There were multiple connotations to his question, and I tried my best to sort of filter it out, and it wasn't very well framed. But I did think that one aspect that we could discuss is that gender, sexual rights, reproductive rights, they're not considered, as you said, that for some it's not considered to be at the forefront, and we don't need to devote that much time and energy discussing them when other basic economic and social rights have not been discussed. But for, of course, some groups, it is very much the foundation. So how do we sort of delicately balance this in the context of the larger rights discourse? Is it that those who advocate for these rights need to assert them very, very clearly, because there is no question of compromise out here?
I'm just trying to unravel all
it's
that.
It's a complicated question.
I think there's
actually, Sarah, I'll just read out what his comments. So maybe.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I
think of if we promote the rights of LGBTQ plus peoples, then that's going to be the end of humanity because they cannot procreate. Well, obviously, many people in same-sex relationships are having children in various ways and making absolutely great parents and bringing up those children with often a different view of the world, which I think is very positive. I also think that people have a choice, and not everybody is going to suddenly become LGBTQ or plus, and so therefore we're always going to have that balance. I don't really think that is necessarily a valid argument or should be a valid concern. I don't think we're going to see the end of humanity because everyone's going to stop having children. But I think the issue of morals is quite interesting, because when we think about rights, then some people argue that they're actually just Western morals put into a frame of rights and put into this universal agenda, but they actually stem from Western morality. And that's an argument that obviously is very problematic in many different levels. But I think the notion of sex and sexual rights are about morals. Well, most rights are about morals somewhere along the line. So, I don't know, Joshua, if you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that somehow you would gain rights because of your propensity to procreate feels like a very limited. It rules out that would mean that children who usually don't have children would perhaps not have a voice. Women who choose not to have children wouldn't have a voice. Men who may decide to sow the seed or widely but not necessarily bring up those children ought not to have a voice. Perhaps they ought not to. So elderly people, women past menopause. I mean, so it seems like a very, very, very narrow frame to think about who's entitled to rights and who are rights holders. I would flip it the other way around, and I think this is more in line with what Sarah is saying as well. For me, the key is really, how do you protect the inherent dignity and worth of every individual? If that means picking a particular moral code, I'm happy to sign up to it. If that means picking a moral code that is culturally insensitive, then I think it needs dialogue. But I don't think it needs dismissal. I still think that sometimes those cultural codes may have been framed in one particular context, and so what? I don't have a problem with that. I think we need to have dialogue. I think, for instance, if you argue that women's rights are something of a Western creation, first of all, I don't think that you would find enough evidence to back that up. But even if you were going to argue that, and I've heard that argued quite a lot in the Global South, then you'd basically say, okay, and so what? So what if they are? Does that mean that women in the South don't have access to it? Because if you can find a system to equally protect women's rights and women's dignity as you do men's, and that comes from, I don't know, one particular country or one particular place, do you really care? Should you somehow relegate all women in the Global South to a secondary status because, oh, well, that didn't originate from the South? So I think these are the questions. And let me just say, there is no evidence to suggest that these forms of morality, even if that's what you want to call them, exist only in one society. You find evidence in religious books, you find evidence in the way in which societies interact, and perhaps if you haven't come across that, it just means that you haven't found it yourself yet, and that perhaps you need to go out and find it a little bit more and engage with those societies and those cultures more. You have matrilineal indigenous peoples. Yeah, I mean, those societies too, they had no contact with the Western world where these ideas may have emanated. You have absolutely isolated pockets of communities, indigenous peoples who have a very strong rights awareness. They didn't get that from some colonial process. So it's nuanced, I think, is all I'll say. And that in your starting point should not be, what do you wear? What do you look like? What hair color do you have? What skin color do you have? What you do in your bedroom at night? Whether you are a fast runner or you have a disability, all really irrelevant questions to me. The question just is who you are. How do you create a society that protects your inherent dignity and worth? That's the question.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I'd like to actually give a special shout out to Charuta Ghajbiye, who has tuned in from Maharashtra, India, because noting that it is midnight out here, and so they're tuned in and they're discussing live. So I thought that I'll just raise their question. They've said that there are different perceptions. I think something that we were just talking about, that there are different perceptions of human rights looking at people's educational and social awareness. Is there a way in which, what do we do to make this more or less universal? Because I think this is a question that we have discussed in the past, but this is something that they're very conscious of, and they said and coming back to the main question, how universal are universal human rights?
You want to go first?
First, universal human rights. Well, people have argued right from the beginning they were never universal because they never agreed as universally agreed rights right from the start. And then if we look at them actually in practice, we could argue that across the globe there's many rights that are not universally agreed and not being put into practice. If we're looking at, and I think it goes back to what Joshua was saying earlier, we either focus on those rights which are contested and go around in circles arguing about them, or we focus on those rights which are less contested and push forward on those that we can have the agreement on. And if we're looking at it in that sense, around universality, I think then it's important to look for those that we can all more or less agree on, and therefore say, okay, these are the ones that at the moment, let's all agree and let's all move forward. And then if we do that, and if we work together and we're all talking together and the same language, then I think that might help in terms of other rights that are less universally agreed to start that conversation and move forward on that.
Yeah. No, I think
that's an optimistic response from you.
It is an optimistic response from you, and you are given bouts of optimism in these conversations, as hopefully our viewers and listeners will find. No, but I think your question is also about that element of education and exclusion, if I understood that right. Could you just confirm that, Chideshwari?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, how universal are rights? So let's start off this way. So human rights have a legacy that goes back to the 12th, 13th century. You find them in ancient societies, etc. Let's not tease that one further. Let's start the journey from 70 years ago. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Chiteshwari made reference to. You know, the 10th of December was the 70th anniversary of the passage of that particular document. Now, when it was framed, it was completely aspirational. No questions about it. A bunch of very elite people met in some very elite rooms, had some conversations that they hoped to create a system that would somehow yield a world in which inherent dignity and worth would be protected and we would avoid conflict. Very much that was a scenario. But that aspiration, in a sense, fueled a movement. And what it did also was to fuel a series of norm creation processes that were reflected in legal systems. So all legal systems, with no exception, all legal systems across the world now have a fairly strong human rights basis, even though the mechanisms they've created may be flawed, and those rights that are created sit in a dusty capital city and have no access for real people. So your point is well made, and I agree with that particular sentiment. If you draw from that the conclusion that human rights are not universal, then in a sense, you're partly correct and you're partly wrong. You're partly correct in that most people, the universe, doesn't fully know about it. So in that sense, you're correct. But you're partly wrong you're not quite wrong, actually. You're partly maybe inaccurate in that this is a movement towards, it's a journey towards somewhere. And that journey, ends, if you like, or maybe it doesn't end. Maybe it should continue when it gets there. But that journey finishes at a point in which you have societies that, irrespective of your gender, your class, your religion, your ethnicity, your level of education, your wealth, irrespective of any of those aspects, will get you access to the fruits of rights. So that's where we are at the moment. You're absolutely right. The rich protect their rights better, have their rights better protected. The poor, it's, mind the gap. They are very far away from these particular rights, and they often need advocates to advocate for them. And that's also a problem, because the advocates they call on are people like Sarah and me, who maybe are well versed in the language of rights, but no longer live that experience of exclusion. So there are massive challenges ahead. And I mean, one of the things that this organization that I'm working at now, Minority Rights Group International, does is primarily to work in those gaps, to look at the extent to which people far from sites of power gain access to any of the rights that they have promised. They're all in the constitutions of those states. But if they don't know about those rights, they can't articulate their case. Even if they can articulate the case, they might do it in the wrong language. Even if they get it in the right language, they might not be listened to because they're doing it in the wrong place. So there are many, many, many hurdles to overcome in that particular journey. And I think the quest for universal rights will be a continuous one.
I think the question around the role of education in that as well, because obviously education can help people understand what their rights are, articulate those rights, demand those rights. But of course, education can also do the opposite.
Yeah.
And allow a group to know their rights and another group to not know their rights and to keep them that way. So I think education in itself is not the answer, it's the type of education. Absolutely.
When we talk about exclusion and awareness, even in education, there's a lot of exclusion and access in that question of, Thank you for both those insights, actually. Very good.
Late in the night for.
Sorry?
I hope it was worth waking up to our viewer listener in Maharashtra.
I hope so. I hope so too. Charuta, if you're still there, please drop in a line in a question out here. So actually, there's an interesting comment, and I don't think that we can really delve further into this because it is just a comment, but I thought I'll just sound you on it so you know what's going on in the chat. What is your opinion? Viorica, I hope I've said that correctly. Viorica Olaru from Romania has just said that. What is your opinion about the very popular Professor Yuval Noah Harari's idea that there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, and no human rights, except in the common imagination of human beings? So a comment that has come in. Do you both have an opinion on this?
Well, pithy statements are what are often useful to write in journals and sell books. But yeah, I mean, I can see why that perspective is valid. But I'm not sure what I can do with it. I'm not sure, other than admire the alliteration. I'm not sure what else I can do and comment on. So,
okay, thank you.
What was the part at the end?
So there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, and no human rights, except in the common imagination of human beings. So it's sort of a positive statement as well, maybe. If we have a common imagination.
Yeah, well, the notion that is what we construct.
Yeah.
And we construct those things, and that's how we bring them into reality.
Yeah.
So if you take the positive from that, if we're constructing things that are good for our society, we're constructing rights, and we make them real, and we make them real through discourse, we make them real through action, then that can be seen to be a positive. We leave them in the imagination just as constructs, and that's a different issue. But if we actually act on them and move them from our imagination, because just by doing, we can make something that was not real.
Yeah. I mean, it's the powerful idea behind this for those who are so minded to appreciate its power is the fact that you want to create a world where, irrespective of your birth, you have the ability to succeed, whatever success means. And I think that's also an idea. That's also an imagination. But it was a shared imagination. And it was a shared imagination, certainly for the drafters of post-1948, but really the drafters of many legal documents. It's a shared awareness. Now, whether that permeates into a wider society and a wider societal realm depends. So you often have many gatekeepers who prevent people from accessing many of these fruits. And as a result, that imagination stays as imagination of some and doesn't result in the kind of implementation that you're talking about for it to be real, for it to be realized in a meaningful way.
Because I think that notion of having the imagination, being able to think, being able to aspire, to be able to dream, is something that fundamentally, for example, in some of the research that I've done in the past with Dave Quentro, and we've asked people about your aspirations, and people can't even articulate an aspiration. They can't think of the future in that positive way. And often when they do, when you talk to older people, they can only think about it in terms of their children. And maybe their children can get more education, they can get a better job. But that ability to be able to dream, to imagine, to aspire is something that so many people still don't feel able to do that. And that saddens me, and it's fundamentally problematic in our society when we've still got groups of people who are just can't imagine.
Likewise with the point about there are no gods. I mean, for many people who are secular, they would buy into that easily. But the vast majority of the world's populations are religious. And so for them, that would be already a blasphemy of some kind to think that there are no gods. And, so in a sense that it's such a varied landscape in terms of the imaginations that people have. I would just love to see people coalesce around a central idea, which is that every individual matters. And if we can coalesce around that simple idea, and I don't think there's any religious or secular texts or books that seem to suggest that individuals are not important. If we can coalesce around that particular idea and then find ways to guarantee and uphold that as more than an idea, so beyond the imagination into reality, then that can be a shared reality. Is it a shared reality today? Of course not. No.
Actually, Viorica has just texted back in to say that she wanted to clarify that she does not necessarily agree with it, but because she's been working with the UN Migration Agency and UNDP for over 10 years, this is an author that has actually been written and supported by many. So she just wanted your comments on this. So Viorica, I hope that you've heard from both our instructors. I think they've given you enough of their perspectives and insight on that. And Charuta also chatted back in to say that yes, they're very much still online, and thank you for for your insights on this. May I ask Jeff could you please rephrase your question? I'm not able to understand it. He's asking whether civilizations and epidemics. So if you could just put your question back in, I think, and just be a little bit more clear, I would love to put that question across to our instructors. We have a lot of people speaking about the fact that human rights are largely a legal context, very legally understood, comprehensible to most people who've only studied the law, interpret that, and therefore, because the government implements it, the government chooses to implement them in the way that they wish to implement them, and therefore they also end up violating a lot of these rights. And well understood, well received. Since both of you have been actively involved with civil society that has continuously challenged your governments when such charters and treaties have been violated, maybe you could let us know about citizen involvement in this process, because yes, it does seem very upward, it does seem to be very out there, and it just seems to be in the realm of people in the circle of government or academia or civil society. How do everyday citizens, when in our day-to-day lives, how do we get involved in this process?
You want to start? I mean, look, the starting point, first of all, the critique is well made. Yes, it does seem like a closed discussion in some very small circles, and that aspire for a world that even they don't then realize, and even they don't fully believe in, it seems. So without a doubt, that has been the issue. But when you look at many of the progressive movements over the last 6 or 7 decades, you see an articulation of some type of human rights. You see an articulation in terms of some type of human rights, even in the Arab Spring, when there was ideas there about the fact that there should be a rule of law and there should be protection of human rights. And why is it that the people who govern us have all of these luxuries and we are here in poverty? That's an articulation of human rights. You saw it in the right to food case in India, where civil society mobilized across a range of different actors in a range of different states, ethnicities, languages, religions, and really said, you are a government that ought to give us food that's getting rotten in your warehouses while there are people that are hungry. That was an articulation of a human right. So there are The Black Lives Matter debate that's taking place, that continues to take place in the United States of America, that is articulating very strong views on human rights. The anti-Trump migration response, which I have to say has been awe-inspiring in many cases, that is articulating a number of different human rights. Now, you might say, well, oh, that's not human rights. That's just individuals standing up for themselves. Well, that's what human rights are about. They are about individuals standing up for themselves, but not standing up in a way that's vulnerable. So not standing up, not one individual standing up with some idea that somebody else can dismiss. First of all, it's a collective action. Many different civil society organizations support these kinds of movements, and they support it based on received wisdom. So states have already agreed to this. States have already said that they accept the obligation to create human rights mechanisms. So you're not asking a state to do something new. You're just asking a state to make real what they have already promised. And that is often done through citizens, and that's often done through populations. And by the way, it's not always just citizens. One of the big issues that we're facing in the globe today is statelessness. The fact that a number of different communities are not given citizenship or are stripped of their citizenship, and as a consequence of which they seem to be beyond the realm of law. So law doesn't even recognize them. Law doesn't even see who they are. So how can they use the law? So I think there are all of these kinds of movements where communities are coming together and articulating a vision that's maybe their own vision, but is based on a reality of agreed principles.
When you were talking just then, I was thinking back again to, and I think that a lot of people don't talk rights. They take action, or they mobilize for change, or they demand something from their government, but they don't necessarily use the rhetoric of rights.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of action going on across the globe that we don't see to be human rights action. But it's people, as Joshua said, are actually talking around those principles, but because they don't know them, they don't use that language necessarily. But they are, just by standing up and taking action, then they are demanding their right. And what's interesting then is sometimes they can get further by using that language, but sometimes, in fact, just what they're doing is powerful in their own right without having to use rights. Sure. But the difference with rights is, of course, it suggests someone has a duty to respond. There's an obligation there, and that's what makes it powerful. When people can use that discourse, when they say, okay, we suddenly realise, and if you look at, say, violence against women and girls, then often women see it as a problem, an individual problem of themselves. And when they realise it's a collective issue, when they realise it's social structures, when they realise this right, then it moves from an individual wanting change to someone having the duty, the responsibility, the obligation through law to actually make that change. So it's that progression, it's that path.
Yeah.
So across the globe, as Josh has pointed out, some really good examples of everyday acts of rights, demands for rights without it even being articulated as such. And I think that's what we've got to go for a lot of hope for.
I think that's it. And I think, in a sense, there is one perspective that would say, oh, everything's broken, rights are failing. But that's not the perspective of actually many people who are in the struggle. Colin Gonsalves, the noted human rights lawyer from India, calls them struggle communities. They struggle for their rights. That doesn't mean they're going to get them tomorrow, but they know this is a long-term struggle. And part of that struggle, frankly, would have happened even if there weren't agreed human rights, because these are communities and people that are struggling to fix their local situation. The fact is that there is a system that exists that they may not know about. It's getting those two worlds to meet. That is the challenge. And when you can get those two worlds to meet, you find, in Sarah's example of an individual woman who faces violence, you find solidarity and you find remedies. And I think that's the key, using that solidarity to find remedies and compel a duty bearer, the state or business maybe, to give the rights that they actually are obliged to give, rather than because they want to give them, because they want to be generous.
I think the power of coming from those everyday actions is also it helps change attitudes.
Yeah.
Because if you just got the legal system, that doesn't change the attitude, it doesn't change the social norms. But those everyday actions, when people come together and collectively decide that actually what's going on is wrong, what's going on does need to change, and we need to then start changing, and that's what makes it very powerful, and that's what brings real change.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sarah, for giving that wonderful perspective on looking at rights and then making it a duty and an obligation that somebody needs if you use the language. But of course, encouraging and supporting the continuous everyday action that people take. And Joshua, thank you for correcting me, because I use the word citizens very casually. And then I realized I'm speaking from my own privilege, because I am the citizen of a country, and I didn't even think about the fact that
point. Actually, I didn't mean to correct you, because you are absolutely right when you talk about citizens. Generally, human rights are understood as something of a contract between an individual citizen and their government. That is generally how it's understood. So you're absolutely right in talking about citizens, right? Because that's the route through which it flows. So residents get rights too, who are non-citizens, because they are in a particular society, but they usually don't have the same rights as citizens do. So a long-term doesn't have the same rights to maybe vote in elections as a citizen would. Similarly, travelers, people who are passing through, visiting tourists, get rights, but they don't necessarily get the rights that residents do or that citizens. So there's a hierarchy, in other words. But the reason I take this example is to say that actually you might think that citizenship of any given country is a starting point. Actually, for a lot of people, it's even not that.
I know. I mean, yeah, it's wonderful. This is when you become so conscious of your privilege, because I would love us for us in another session, in a separate session, we should discuss more about minorities and of course refugees, which will come in the future sessions. But I think it's worth us getting back to that point. There's a very interesting question that has come in by Katie. And she says that if you have states and international organizations enforcing human rights and encouraging other states and organizations to enforce human rights, do you believe that this could lead to an absence of anarchy, where you end up with an overarching body that has the power to coerce states into enforcing human rights and using force if necessary? This is actually a topic for our later modules, but if we could just touch upon this and then wrap up today's session.
Yeah.
Human rights. Well, it's a tricky one.
Using force where necessary.
Using force, because obviously the enforcer of human rights, many people would think, is the United Nations as the overarching international framework. And but then, of course, when you think about the United Nations, made up of individual nations and each maintaining their sovereignty, so of course then you have the issue of, can the United Nations enforce if it then infringes on the sovereignty of a nation? So you have nations trying to persuade other nations to adhere to rights, but the use of force, it's funny actually, we were having a conversation in one of my classes today around to what extent should you actually force nations to comply with rights, and at which point does that become a violation of rights in order to enforce rights? Joshua, do you think force should be brought to...
No. I think straightforward answer, no, because I don't, I like to think that discussions can be had based on the force of argument rather than the argument of force. Because the argument of force, the problem is just depends on who has more overwhelming force. But Katie, your question is well framed. Let's go back 200 years, if you don't mind. I'm not going to spend 200 years getting to my point, but let's go back 200 years. And you think there were a bunch of states who argued that there was a need to civilize the rest of the world. And there was a group of states who thought that they needed to Christianize the rest of the state. And that led to colonization. Some of the people who were out there to do the colonization were just there to exploit resources. But there were many other liberal people, probably not dissimilar from many of the audiences, many people on this audience, liberal people who thought, you know what, we should go to, in inverted commas, deepest, darkest Africa, and bring them Christianity and civilize them. There were these elements there. We have to guard against that kind of a process. Because if you had enforceable human rights, the question would be, who would be enforcing them exactly today? Would we really trust the UN Security Council to be enforcing those human rights? With a Brexiting Britain, a Trump-led US, a French president that's not fully popular even with his own citizens, a Chinese president who's trying to create a new Silk Road and wield influence, a Russian president whose whose human rights itself would be, who basically oversees a system that doesn't necessarily pay much attention to human rights. Who would enforce it? If you look at the wider Security Council, there's states that are likewise with poor human rights record. If you look at the UN Human Rights Council, You've got among those states that are elected onto the Human Rights Council, states with problematic records. So I would be very wary. Instead, I would go with and endorse what Sarah said. It's about persuasion. It's about sitting states down and making states understand in a pragmatic way that actually giving rights to everybody will make everybody better off. Giving rights to somebody will not somehow make somebody else worse off. This is a very limited vision of, I think, how life operates. And actually, if you do manage to give rights and make sure that everybody has access to all those rights, society will grow. You'll have more people that might be working on solutions to brain cancer. You'll have more people that might be working on environmental challenges. You'll have more people trying to engage with the kinds of problems we have, other than a select group who are making sure that that work is only for them and won't allow everyone else in. So this idea of inclusion is fundamental. But no, I would never want to see human rights being enforced. I don't want to see enforcement of anything, to be honest. For too long, we've had people saying, we will use war to stop war. A bit of a flawed argument, because if you're using war to stop war, that means that war is legitimate. If war is legitimate, then the question is whether you like that war or not like that war. I don't think we need to be that subjective about it. So enforcing rights, even though from time to time I would love to see the axe of human rights fall upon some of the necks that we have running our show today, enforcement, no, that's a step too far.
Thank you. So we are getting a couple of questions as I had actually declared an intention to close. So I was just wondering whether we should entertain maybe one more question before. How are both of you sorted for time?
We are fine. I'm worrying about poor Charu in Maharashtra.
Yeah, Charu's still here, and there's a couple of extra other pieces of people who've come in. I'm just looking at Sardha. Actually, we've already answered your question. If you could just go back to this, and I will talk about it. Jeff has raised a question about human rights in the context of human beings versus other species, which I thought that we can raise in another question, because that's a much bigger question and well beyond, I mean, of course, within the scope of the larger sustainable development question, but maybe not for this introductory session that we have on.
That is a big question. Let's pick it up again.
Okay, so let me just say, let me just quote his questions. Why should Homo sapiens hold rights on other species, knowing big mammals are endangered, extinct, new microorganisms evolve, yet people are dependent of all other species, on all other species in a very holistic manner? So interspecies collaborations and rights versus human rights, looking at Homo sapiens. So just man's position in this wonderful world where there's life on land and life below water, and where we stand in this entire fragile ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a very big question, and we should reserve it for another time. But I mean, just to say that absolutely, when human rights were framed, it was framed without enough awareness of the fact that we need to worry in a much more holistic way about our planet. Absolutely, no question about that, Jeff. But the human rights terminology you get is essentially has evolved out of human history. And human history, at least the bit that's written down, by people who are quite close to sites of power, hasn't always paid enough attention. They've taken the natural environment to be essentially just there to serve human interests. So there has been a change, but that change hasn't yet made its way enough into our thinking. And I think that destruction, the wanton destruction on a daily basis of our planet, is what has led to us even the need for sustainable development goals. So the point is well made, and I think we will pick this up in due course when we talk about this. There should not be a privileged position at all for human rights over any other kinds of rights. If we can find a way to understand consent. Consent is a key here. We need to understand whether or not the people or the individuals or the species or the groups that we're trying to protect have consent. Otherwise, we are being patronizing towards them. We are patronizing them by protecting their rights against ours. So this is we have to find some way of engaging a conversation to understand. But planetary issues have been neglected, and the human rights frame has been very, very poor at trying to articulate any kind of protection for anyone other than themselves.
I think things have been changing. And I think when we think about non-human rights, then I stopped eating meat when I was 17. So it's a long time ago. And at that time, it was considered a bit strange, a bit odd to even, and I stopped because of the way that animals were being raised and reared, and now it's become a general conversation. And it's a conversation a lot of people are having, and it's a conversation that's leading to a lot of change, not just in animal welfare, but in terms of people stopping eating meat, etc., etc. So I think we are becoming more aware, but the rights brain hasn't caught up with that, and not sure how the rights brain could catch up with that. That's why it'd be a really interesting topic for the future for us to think about how would you articulate that? How can you balance that?
But as you were speaking, I was thinking about, of course, the Indian context where it's gone the other way around. You've had a strong sense of vegetarianism and a strong sense of living in harmony with the environment. And as you get more wealthy, there's actually an increase in consumption of meat. So sometimes it's even the context has varied so much. But yeah, having that conversation on other rights would be very useful, but we'll pick that up in the context of climate change.
Yeah, and I think that definitely circles back into why there is a big course that we have on human rights called Human Rights, Human Wrongs, and promoted and produced and hosted by the SDG Academy, because we definitely see this to be in the larger SDG framework. And I hope that through this discourse and over the next 11 weeks, people see it in the broader context, and we'll definitely bring back those questions in our live sessions. And on that note, I think I will wrap up today's session and thank everybody who has joined in. I can see comments coming in from Somalia, India, the UK, and Romania, at least those for the places that were mentioned, and a couple of other people who've just joined in more recently. Please note that these live sessions are every other Monday of this while the course is open. You will find more information about the live sessions in the little tab that is there above you. Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us today. And I hope you've enjoyed this introductory discussion. Let's get into some core issues in the weeks to come. And I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful time learning with a new bunch of students who seem to have a lot of interesting perspectives in their collective imagination, so to speak.
Fabulous.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks also to Rebecca, who facilitates these sessions but refuses to come onto camera.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Good night. Okay. Bye.